He found her bleeding in the tall grass, blue skin glowing under Nova's twin moons. The colony's law screamed, "Leave her." Contact with Azure Ones meant exile or worse. But Caleb Mercer wasn't a soldier, just a farmer who remembered what his mother taught him about helping those in need. That single choice would ignite a war between species and redefine courage on this frontier world. The twin suns burned relentlessly on the prefab domes, their heat flattening the struggling crops between settlement modules. 3 years since the crash, and the colony still looked temporary, like a camp that might pack up tomorrow except there was nowhere to go. 200 souls remained, their survival hinging on the Council's strict rationing and harsher judgments. Every calorie, every drop of water, every scrap of salvaged metal was accounted for. Decisions weren't about comfort or morality, only about whether an action would help the group live another week. The alternative was collective extinction, a quiet fact that hung in the air like the ever-present dust. Raiders came without pattern, striking where defenses were thinnest. The Croci took what they wanted: food stores, tools, sometimes people. Their motives were unclear, their methods brutal. After sunset, the perimeter fence hummed with weak electrical current, the only thing keeping the nocturnal predators at bay. Night stalkers moved in the darkness beyond, their multi-limbed shadows sometimes visible in the moonlight. The Council's most absolute law concerned the Azure Ones. No contact, no exceptions. They were deemed too unpredictable, too alien. Their biology and culture a perceived threat to a colony one bad harvest from collapse. This law was born from fear, not experience, and it was enforced without mercy. Exile was the standard penalty. For some, it was a quicker, quieter end. Caleb Mercer worked the algae vats his family had maintained since landing. The work was monotonous, the green slurry smelling of damp earth and something vaguely metallic. He was just another face in the crowd, another set of hands doing what needed doing. He kept his head down, followed the rules, remembered the screams and fire of the crash that took half of them on day one. That memory never left him. The sound of tearing metal or the sight of a failing power cell could bring it back in a rush. The constant weight was fear. Fear of the Croci, fear of the night, fear of the silent blue-skinned natives they were told to avoid, fear of the slow starvation that crept closer each season. This was the reality of Nova, a world that gave nothing freely and took without warning. It was this reality that made the choice he was about to make so extraordinary. In a place where every action was measured against collective survival, an act of pure individual compassion wasn't just rare. It was revolutionary. It was a spark in a tinderbox. Caleb Mercer was 17. His world was the barn that still smelled of earthwood, the algae vats he cleaned daily, and a single memory of his mother's voice. He mended broken fences patched together from starship wreckage. He didn't fire the colony's railguns. He worked the soil. He had a quiet competence, but it was a farmer's skill. He knew how to coax growth from stubborn seeds, how to read the moisture levels in the air, how to fix a pump with scavenged parts. His mind worked in patterns of seasons and harvests, not tactics and engagements. Killing wasn't his trade. Sustaining life was. He knew the colony's defenses because he'd helped build some of them. He'd spliced wiring for the perimeter fence, reinforced weak points with scrap metal. The entire settlement was a monument to improvisation and sheer stubbornness, every system held together by hope and desperation. He'd hauled the materials, felt the strain in his back, seen the designs evolve from theory into rickety reality. His hands were proof of his life. They were calloused and permanently stained from nutrient solutions in soil, the skin tough and ridged from gripping tools and hauling lines. They had never held a weapon in anger, had never learned the specific grip of a plasma rifle or the weight distribution of a combat knife. They were made for creating, not destroying. He carried no rank, held no title. In the colony's fragile hierarchy, he was just another pair of hands, another body for labor detail. He followed orders from the Council and the security lead Fletcher. He was background, a face you'd see at ration distribution and then forget. He was designed not to be noticed, yet he remembered the stories. The first scouts talked about them in hushed tones around dying campfires. The Azure Ones, how they moved through the tall grass without a sound, their blue skin like polished stone under the moons. The reports that came later were different. Official bulletins called them monsters, territorial and violent, a primary reason for the no-contact law. The stories conflicted, and most people chose to believe the fear. His mother's lesson was the quiet counterpoint to all that noise. It wasn't a grand philosophy, just something she'd said back on Earth, a simpler time that felt like a story itself. You help because you can. She'd said it while bandaging a neighbor's kid who fell out of a tree. It was a simple, practical code. You see someone who needs help, you help. It wasn't a debate about risk or reward. It was just what you did. This was the foundation he stood on, not on military training or a hunger for glory, but on the memory of a mother's basic decency. In a colony ruled by fear and survival math, that made him the unlikeliest kind of hero. He wasn't a weapon looking for a war. He was a farmer who remembered how to be a person. That memory was the one tool the colony hadn't accounted for. The one variable that could change the equation of their entire existence on this harsh, new world. It was a quiet thing, almost forgotten, but it was still there. He didn't radio it in. The comm unit stayed silent on his belt. He moved. He stepped past the humming perimeter wire, his boots sinking into the soft, unfamiliar soil of the contested space. The air felt different out here, charged, unprotected. He was outside the fence, alone. Every rustle of the xenograss sent a jolt through him. He froze, listening. It could be the wind. It could be a Croce scout, silent and watching from the shadows, waiting for a clean shot. It could be a council patrol on their evening sweep. Either one would end this. A plasma bolt from a raider or an arrest order from his own people. The outcome would be the same. He took another step, then another, a slow advance into the unknown. He kept his hands open, held away from his body. He had a knife on his belt, a tool for cutting rope and opening crates. He made sure it was visible, sheathed, a signal of non-aggression. Or at least he hoped it was a signal. He had no idea what their customs were, what gestures meant peace or threat. He only knew that empty hands were a universal sign of no immediate harm. He hoped. He got closer. The shape in the grass resolved into clearer detail. It was definitely female, her build slighter than he'd first thought. She flinched as his shadow fell over her, a quick, pained spasm. She tried to push herself up, to get her feet under her, but her arms buckled instantly. She had no strength left. She collapsed back into the dirt, a low sound escaping her, something between a gasp and a whimper. Her eyes found his. They were large, completely dark pools of black that reflected the twin moons. There was no white to them, just deep, intelligent darkness. He saw the pain there, a sharp, focused agony that made his own side ache in sympathy. But he also saw a clarity, a sharp awareness that was assessing him, calculating the threat. This was no animal. This was a thinking being, terrified and in torment. The wound was worse up close. A brutal tear ran along her side, not a clean cut. It was ragged, like something had hooked and ripped. Claw marks maybe, or a crude blade. The edges of the gash were inflamed, a darker blue than the surrounding skin. The strange blue-silver fluid that was her blood had seeped out and congealed in an odd way. It hadn't clot like human blood. It had formed a brittle, crystalline crust over the injury, like a poorly applied sealant. More of the liquid welled up from beneath this crust with each shallow breath she took, threatening to break it open. He spoke. His voice was low, softer than he usually used. The words didn't matter. She wouldn't understand "it's okay" or "I'm here to help." The meaning was in the tone, the absence of aggression. The calm, steady sound he used to soothe the spooked animal back in the barn. He kept talking, nonsense words, a quiet stream of sound meant to be a blanket, not a weapon. The calculation was over. The debate between law and lesson was done. He was here. She was here. She was dying. He had made the choice the moment he stepped over the wire. Now came the action. He knelt in the dirt beside her, the sharp grass blade scraping against his pants. He reached out. Not for his knife. Not for a weapon. His hand, open and empty, moved slowly toward her shoulder, the least injured part of her he could see. It was a gesture. A question. The first act of defiance was complete. The first contact was about to be made. Getting her back unseen was its own kind of battle. The choice was made, the contact broken, but now the real work began. He had to move an injured, possibly hostile alien across several hundred meters of open ground and into his barn without a single soul noticing. The distance felt infinite. She was lighter than he expected when he lifted her. Her frame was all lean muscle and light bone, built for the low gravity and tall grasses of her world. He got one arm under her shoulders, the other under her knees, and lifted. The dead weight was still a strain, but manageable. The real weight was the risk. A single sweep of a patrol rover's spotlight from the main gate would end it. The light would catch them, freeze them in its beam. There would be shouting, orders, the distinct crack of a rifle being shouldered. It would be over in seconds. He didn't take the direct route. That was a straight line to a quick arrest. He moved laterally first, staying low in the high grass, putting distance between them and the point of contact. Then he angled toward the settlement, but not toward the gates. He headed for the old irrigation network. The ditches were mostly dry now, a relic of the first year's failed farming attempts. They were overgrown with tough native weeds, providing cover. He knew these paths from solitary walks, from times he needed to get away from the crowded domes and the constant, low-grade anxiety of colony life. Now that knowledge was a tactical asset. He navigated the shallow trenches, his boots sinking into the damp soil at the bottom. It was slower, but it was hidden. Her breath was shallow and ragged against the side of his neck. Each exhale was hot, a sharp contrast to the cool evening air. It was a constant, worrying reminder of her fragility. He could feel the fever burning through her. He adjusted his grip, careful to avoid the ugly wound on her side. His hand brushed against the skin of her arm. It was unlike any skin he had ever touched. It was cool, like stone that had been resting in shade. It was also perfectly smooth with no pores or hairs, the texture reminding him of a river stone worn down by centuries of water. It was alien utterly and completely. This was not a human being in his arms. This was the absolute forbidden, the thing the laws were written to prevent. He was carrying his own exile. The barn was his sanctuary. It stood on the edge of the settlement, a prefab structure expanded with local lumber and scrap metal. It smelled of damp earth, of stored grain from the last semi-successful harvest, of the sharp, clean scent of the algae vats. It was his space, his responsibility, the one place where he had some measure of control. He reached the side door, the one with the sticky latch he'd been meaning to fix. He shouldered it open, slipped inside, and let the darkness swallow them. He laid her down gently in the far corner, behind a stack of crates filled with nutrient paste bricks. It was the most hidden spot, shielded from view from any of the windows or the main door. The crates offered a thin wall, a pathetic barricade against the consequences of his actions. In the dim light filtering through a high window, he looked at her. She was curled on the dusty floor, shivering, her blue skin seeming to absorb the shadows. The reality of what he had done landed on him then, a physical weight that made his knees feel weak. This wasn't a theoretical breach of protocol. This was a living, breathing violation of the colony's most fundamental law, hidden in his home. He had jeopardized everything for one person. The scale of his crime was immense. His barn, his place of peace and routine, was now a secret operating theater, a prison of his own making, built not from bars but from an act of mercy. A farmer's knowledge pressed against an alien body. His tools were wrong. Caleb had a basic med kit, a small plastic case salvaged from the wreckage of their ship. It was designed for humans. Stitched cuts, bone fractures, infection from earthborne bacteria. It held nothing for a wound like this, for a physiology he did not understand. Every action he took was a gamble with her life. There was no guide, no precedent, just guesswork and hope. He opened the kit. The contents looked pathetic. He took a clean cloth and a bottle of purified water, meant for drinking. He wouldn't use the antiseptic wipes. He had no idea what the chemicals in them would do to her system. He dampened the cloth and started cleaning the area around the wound. He was careful not to touch the strange, hardened crust of her blood. It looked brittle, like a scale of blue glass. He didn't want to break it and start the bleeding again. He just cleaned the skin, wiping away dirt and dried fluid. Her skin was cool and smooth under his touch. Her whole body shook with a fever he couldn't understand. He pulled a thermal blanket from the kit, a crinkly silver sheet that reflected body heat. An earth technology. He wrapped it around her shoulders, tucking it gently. It was a gesture. It might do nothing for an alien fever, but it was a gesture of care. It was all he had. He remembered the stories, not from a manual, but from the old days before the colony had given up on local flora. There was a plant that grew near the eastern valleys, a low bush with silver-veined leaves and clusters of small, deep purple berries. One of the first botanists, before she'd died in a Croce raid, had theorized they had antiseptic properties. She'd called them a potential resource. The council had deemed it too risky. Testing unknown xenoflora was a quick way to poison yourself. The project was scrapped. He looked at the feverish alien on his floor. Risk was all he had left. He had a few dried samples of the plant in a jar, kept from that old abandoned study. He took a mortar and pestle, a tool for grinding grains, and crushed a handful of the dried berries into a thick, dark paste. It smelled bitter, like earth and something metallic. He had no idea if it was medicine or poison for her. He applied the poultice to the clean skin around the wound, avoiding the crystalline blood seal. He hoped it would fight any infection. He hoped it wouldn't kill her. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Her murmurs were a fluid language of soft clicks and low tones, a sound completely alien to his ear. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Pain, fear, disorientation. He watched her face, her breathing, the skin around the wound for any sign of a bad reaction. For redness, swelling, for anything that would tell him his clumsy attempt at help was making everything worse. He was a farmer playing doctor with a patient from another star. His care was not skilled. It was not certain. It was the best he could do with what he had, a combination of half-remembered stories and desperate improvisation. He had no way of knowing if the poultice was working, or if her body was fighting the injury on its own, but he stayed there watching, a silent vigil in the dim barn. The fever seemed to lessen. Her shivering slowly subsided under the crinkly blanket. Her breathing, while still shallow, grew a fraction more steady. It was not a cure. It was not a victory. It was a temporary standstill. His clumsy, uncertain care had been given, and against all odds it had been enough to stabilize her. For now, the fever broke. Her breathing changed first, losing the ragged, shallow pull of sickness. It deepened, steadied. Then her eyes opened. They were no longer clouded with pain or delirium. They were clear, dark pools of sharp intelligence. She was instantly alert, her body tensing minutely as she took in her surroundings. The rough-hewn wood of the barn wall, the stacked crates, the smell of grain and earth. Then her gaze landed on him. Caleb sat a few feet away, watching. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. The tension was a live wire in the air. She was a warrior, he was the enemy. Her people and his were supposed to be at odds. A conflict defined by fear and ignorance. She could be hostile. She had the strength for it now. Her body was coiled, her hands resting near the tools on her woven belt. She assessed him like a threat, her eyes cataloging his posture, his lack of obvious weapon, his distance. He was the pale visitor from the settlement of domes, the one her people were told to avoid. Her hand moved, not toward a weapon. It went to her side. Her long, slender fingers brushed against the clean cloth bandage he'd fixed in place. They traced the edge of the poultice, the dark herbal paste he'd applied. She felt the texture of it, smelled the bitter scent of the crushed berries. She looked from the makeshift medicine back to his face. The calculation in her eyes shifted. The sharp edge of fear began to dull, replaced by a slower, more complex emotion. Wary confusion. The pieces weren't adding up. The enemy does not tend your wounds. The enemy does not give you a blanket. She pointed a finger to her own chest. Her voice, when it came, was softer than he expected. A fluid sound with a melodic click at the end of the word. Liara, she said, a name. It wasn't a sound or a label. It was an identity. She was Liara. Her finger moved again, pointing to a symbol burned into the leather of her chest armor. It was a complex design like interlocking waves or currents. Sire, she stated. This was not her name. This was something larger, a tribe. A belonging. Then she pointed at him, her gesture taking in his general appearance, his pale skin, his human form. Pale visitors, she said. The term was descriptive, observational. It held no immediate malice, just a statement of fact. They were visitors. They were pale. Then she pointed back to herself, a tap on her own blue skin. Nyavi, children of the first water. The name was a story in itself, a claim of origin and identity that reached back into the deep history of this world. The words dismantled the propaganda brick by brick. The Council's report spoke of monsters, of a singular violent threat called the Azure Ones. But she was not an Azure One. She was Liara of the Sire, one of the Nyavi. She had a name. She had a people. She had a culture that named itself after the very water of their world. The amorphous fear the colony lived under began to crack, revealing the individual person beneath. She was not a concept to be feared. She was a wounded warrior in a barn, trying to communicate with the person who had saved her. The first fragile thread of understanding was spun between them in that dim light. It was spun from a name, a gesture, and the quiet acknowledgement that the stories they had been told about each other were incomplete. They were not just two species in conflict. They were two people, and one of them had chosen to help the other. That choice had just been given a name: Liara. Liara smoothed a patch of dust on the barn floor. Her fingers, long and precise, began tracing shapes. She spoke slowly, searching for words she'd learned from listening to patrols, her sentences broken but clear. She was explaining the rules of her world, and they were not suggestions. They were absolute. Her culture was governed by honor. It was the central pillar of their society, a structure built on debt and repayment. A life saved created a specific, non-negotiable obligation. It was not a choice. It was a law as real as gravity. To ignore such a debt was a stain on the individual and the tribe, a violation of their most fundamental principles. She identified her people as the Sire. They were the most powerful Niavi tribe, their influence stretching across vast territories. Their leader was the shaman Taraval, a figure of immense wisdom and authority, who interpreted the ancient codes and ensured their traditions were upheld. His word carried the weight of generations. Then she spoke of the Kroshi. Her voice tightened. They were the outcasts. They had rejected the ancient ways, the honor code that bound the Niavi together. Instead, they pursued their goals through theft and violence. They were raiders, disruptors, a constant threat to the great migration that was central to Niavi life. They did not honor debts. They took what they wanted. She made it clear the Kroshi were not just a Niavi problem. They were a threat to the Pale visitors as well. They saw the human settlement as another resource to plunder, another obstacle to dominate. Their methods were cruel, their presence a poison to any hope of stability on this world. Her warning came then, quiet and solemn. It was not delivered as a threat, but as a statement of cold, hard fact. "The Sire remember those who help us," she said, her dark eyes holding his. "And those who harm us." The sentence hung in the air. It was a promise of long memory and absolute consequence. Actions had weight. They were recorded, and they dictated all future interactions. There was no statute of limitations on honor or vengeance. By saving her life, Caleb had unknowingly entered into this ancient contract. He had not performed a simple act of mercy. He had initiated a formal bond. The Sire, led by the shaman Taraval, were now obligated to recognize this debt. His fate was no longer his own. It was inextricably bound to the complex, unyielding code of Niavi honor. He had stepped from the colony's simple rules of survival into a far older, more intricate web of obligation. His single human choice had just acquired the gravity of an interstellar law. The farmer was now a participant in a game whose rules he was only beginning to understand, and the stakes were the future of everyone on Nova. His days fell into a new, dangerous routine. He would rise with the colony bell, the sound ringing through the thin walls of his quarters. He'd pull on his work clothes, the same worn pants and tunic as everyone else. He'd walk to the algae vats and begin his shift. His hands would check the pH levels, clean the filters, harvest the green biomass. His movements were the same, but his mind was miles away. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a secret keeper. He checked the patrol schedules posted on the comms board, noting the routes and the guards on duty for the coming night. He calculated risks, looked for patterns, found the quiet moments to slip extra nutrient bars from his own rations into his pocket. Every interaction became a potential trap. A neighbor asking about the vat yields, a comment about the latest Kroshi sighting, a simple good morning from Sarah, the young medic. Every word he spoke felt like a lie. He kept his answers short, his tone neutral, his eyes down. He became a careful editor of his own life, pruning away any detail that might lead to a question he couldn't answer safely. The easy trust he'd shared with the other survivors curdled into a constant, low-grade suspicion. He was living a performance for an audience that didn't know it was watching. Fletcher watched him. The head of security had a way of standing too still, of letting his gaze linger a moment too long. He didn't accuse. He didn't question. He just observed. His eyes took in everything. The dirt on Caleb's boots, the tired set of his shoulders, the way he sometimes looked toward the perimeter fence at dusk. It was a vague, unspecific suspicion, the kind a security man develops after years of looking for cracks in the armor. Caleb felt that gaze like a physical weight. He made a point of working harder, of being more visible in his chores, of creating a picture of perfect, bland normality. He became the most diligent farmer in the settlement, all to hide the secret festering in his barn. The council meetings were the worst. They were held in the comms hub, the air thick with recycled air and shared anxiety. They talked strategy, resource allocation, defense. The topic always turned to the Croshi. Their raids were increasing, their tactics growing bolder. The need for vigilance was the constant refrain. Then would come the other subject, the Azure ones. The words were always the same. A single monstrous threat, an unpredictable danger to be avoided at all costs. They spoke of them as a force of nature, a storm to be weathered, not a people to be understood. He would stand there, listening to their fear, and in his mind he would see Liara. He saw her patiently tracing symbols in the dust of his barn floor, teaching him the basic sounds of her language. He saw the intelligence in her dark eyes, the quiet dignity she maintained even in pain. He heard the council's words of monolithic terror and held them against the memory of her soft, clicking voice saying her own name. Liara. The dissonance was a constant, grinding hum in the back of his skull, a wrong note that never stopped playing. He was betraying their trust. He was hiding the very thing they feared most. But he was doing it to uphold a loyalty that felt deeper, older, more fundamentally right than any rule born from pure survival. He was protecting a person, not a principle. The pressure was a physical thing. It lived in the tightness of his shoulders, the shortness of his breath during a casual conversation, the way he'd startle at a sudden noise. The secret was a growing thing, fed by every lie of omission, every guarded glance. It was a fault line running right through the center of his life, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the pressure became too much and the whole thing fractured. The alarm klaxon ripped through the settlement, a harsh electronic scream that killed all other sound. The western sector, Croshi. The thought was a cold punch. Caleb dropped the algae sample he was holding. The glass shattered on the floor. He was moving before the second siren blast finished, joining the stream of others scrambling for the armory. He was a farmer, but today he was a defender. Everyone was. The chaos was immediate and total. The Croshi hit fast and hard. Energy blasts from their scavenged rifles tore chunks from prefab walls. Their warriors swung heavy crude axes, all brute force and rage. The human defense was a mess of desperation. Shock batons met alien muscle. A few old projectile firearms cracked in the gloom. It was close quarters, ugly, a brawl in the dust and smoke. There was no strategy, only survival, each person fighting their own small war in the larger chaos. He saw Sarah. The young medic was cut off from the main group, pressed against the buckled hull of an old cargo hauler. Two Croshi had her cornered. She held a shock baton in a two-handed grip, but her arms were shaking. She was a healer, not a fighter. She was trying to defend a wounded colonist slumped at her feet. There was no clear path to her. The fighting was a shifting wall between them. Caleb tried to push through. A Croshi warrior blocked his way, its thick limbs and heavy armor a moving barricade. He fired his own rifle, the shot pinging off the raider's shoulder plate. It just turned, roared, and advanced. He was pinned down behind a stack of water barrels, unable to get a clean line of sight to Sarah. He could see her, see the fear on her face, but he couldn't reach her. The distance was only 20 meters. It might as well have been a mile. Then movement, a blur from the shadow of his own barn, a streak of blue against the brown and gray of the settlement. It was fast, a low, flowing motion that cut through the chaos. Liara. She was still favoring her side, her movement not quite at full strength, but it didn't matter. She moved with a lethal fluid grace that was entirely alien. She didn't charge. She flowed. She went straight for the Croshi pressuring Sarah. She didn't engage the one facing Caleb. She targeted the one about to land a killing blow on the medic. She didn't use a weapon. Her hands were her tools. She moved inside its swing, too close for the axe to be effective. A quick, precise strike to the warrior's wrist. A nerve cluster, maybe. The axe dropped from numb fingers. A second motion, a sharp twist of its armored elbow. There was a wet pop. The Croshi roared in pain and shock, its arm hanging useless. She hadn't killed it. She had disabled it, completely and efficiently. The action took less than 3 seconds. It created an opening, a tiny window in the wall of violence. Caleb didn't hesitate. He broke from cover, ignoring the Croshi he'd been trading shots with. He sprinted the 20 meters, boots kicking up dust. He grabbed Sarah by the arm, hauled her back, and together they dragged the wounded colonist into the relative safety of a storage module's doorway. He looked back toward the barn. Liara was already gone, vanished back into the shadows she'd emerged from. The fight continued to rage around the disabled Croce, but the immediate threat was over. The act was done, and it had been witnessed. Fletcher stood near the comms hub, his rifle held loosely, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. He'd seen it all. So had a half-dozen other colonists. They'd seen the blue skin, the alien movement, the impossible intervention. The secret was not a secret anymore. It was a fact. A complicated, terrifying, undeniable fact standing right in the middle of their war. The hidden azure was now public knowledge, and nothing would ever be simple again. The comms hub smelled of ozone and sweat. Fletcher had him cornered near the main console, his expression a hard line. His sidearm was still in its holster, but his hand rested on the grip. It wasn't quite aimed, but the threat was clear. The other guards formed a loose half-circle behind him. The raid was over, the immediate danger gone. Now came the interrogation. "Start talking, Mercer," Fletcher said. His voice was low, controlled, but the anger was there, simmering just under the surface. "What was that thing? How long have you been hiding it?" Caleb kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. He gave the only explanation he had. Mercy. Help. A person bleeding in the grass. He spoke of the wound, the fever, the basic act of not leaving someone to die. The words sounded weak in the tense air of the hub. To these men, armed and jumpy from the fight, it didn't sound like compassion. It sounded like treason. It sounded like a dangerous secret kept from the very people who relied on him. Their faces were set, their eyes hard. They saw a breach of security, a violation of the one law that was supposed to keep them safe. Their fear was a wall, and his simple explanation was bouncing right off it. Fletcher's jaw tightened. He was about to give an order. The word detain was forming on his lips. Then the perimeter board lit up. Every status light for the motion sensors and fence monitors flickered from green to a flat, dead gray. Not a breach. Not an alarm. A complete silent shutdown. The systems weren't reporting damage. They were just offline. The hum of the main generator was the only sound. Fletcher's head snapped toward the board, his interrogation forgotten. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, stepping toward the main viewport. Outside, the Nyavi stood. They had arrived without a sound. 100 warriors, maybe more, arranged in perfect silent ranks just beyond the fence line. They didn't advance. They didn't brandish weapons. They simply stood there, a wall of blue-skinned, solemn figures. It wasn't an attack formation. It was a presentation. A display of presence and power that was more intimidating than any charge. At their center stood an older Nyavi. His face was lined with experience and authority, his posture straight and calm amidst the silent army. His eyes were the same deep pools as Liara's, but they held a weight of years and wisdom. This was Taraval. He ignored the armed humans at the viewport. He ignored Fletcher, who had his hand back on his weapon. His gaze swept across the scene and found Caleb. It was a measuring look, an assessment that seemed to take in everything about the young farmer standing in the comms hub. A younger Nyavi at his side, an aide, stepped forward slightly. He spoke in the human language, his accent thick, the words carefully chosen and formal. "The shaman Taraval speaks. You saved my daughter's life." The words landed in the sudden silence. The statement was simple, direct, and it changed everything. Liara was not just a tribeswoman. She was the shaman's daughter. The debt Caleb had unknowingly incurred was not just a tribal matter. It was intensely, irrevocably personal. The entire dynamic in the room shifted. Fletcher's hand slowly came away from his weapon. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. This was no longer a security breach to be contained. This was not a monstrous threat to be eliminated. It was a diplomatic incident of the highest order. The shaman's focus, his acknowledgement, his very presence had instantly reframed the conflict. Caleb was no longer a traitor to be punished. He was the central figure in a delicate negotiation he didn't know how to conduct. The crime scene had just become a negotiating table, and the most powerful man on the planet was looking directly at him. The shaman's gratitude was immense, a formal thing that filled the silent space between them. Taraval spoke through his aide, his voice a low rumble of authority, but the words aimed solely at Caleb. This was no general thank you. It was specific, a detailed accounting of an act whose full weight Caleb had not understood until now. He revealed the deeper layer. Liara had not just been wounded in a skirmish. The Kroshi had captured her. She was bound for one of their rituals, a fate the shaman described with a grim finality that needed no elaboration, a fate worse than death. The words, translated in flat, carried a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The Kroshi did not kill for necessity. They killed for pleasure, for cruel ceremony. To fall into their hands was not just to die. It was to be broken in ways that defied simple explanation. Caleb's act was no longer just a physical rescue. He had not merely saved a life from ending. He had snatched her back from a specific, horrifying destiny. He had granted her a clean death or a continued life, a choice the Kroshi would never have allowed. This changed the entire calculation for the Nyavi. The debt of honor was not single, but doubled. It was a compound interest of obligation, a spiritual weight far greater than anyone in the human settlement could have imagined. A life saved was one thing. A destiny restored was another matter entirely. This depth of debt demanded a formal response. Taroval could not simply nod his thanks and depart. The honor code of the sire, the very fabric of their society, required a public formal recognition. This was not a choice for him. It was a requirement of his station. He had to mark the event, to acknowledge the debtor and the scale of what was owed. It was a ritual as important as any law in their culture. This formal recognition placed Caleb under Nyavi protection. It was a status no human had ever held, a concept so foreign the council members behind him stared in blank confusion. He was no longer just Caleb Mercer, colonist, farmer, trader. He was Caleb Mercer, under the direct protection of Shaman Taraval of the Sire. To harm him now would not be an act against a human. It would be an act against the Nyavi, a violation of their most sacred codes. He had been given a shield his own people could never provide. The council watched, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning, uncomfortable realization. Their paradigm, built on 3 years of fear and a singular view of the blue-skinned natives as monsters, shattered in the quiet space of the comms hub. The monster was a father. The monster had a complex culture of honor. The monster was offering protection to the boy they were about to arrest. Their entire understanding of this world, the foundation of every survival decision they had made, was proven incomplete, built on a foundation of fear instead of fact. Caleb's simple moral choice, made alone in the tall grass, was now validated by the highest authority on the planet. The boy who broke the rules was standing in a circle of armed men, being granted a status that redefined the relationship between their species. His act of mercy was no longer a personal secret or a colony crime. It was an interstellar fact, recognized and ratified by a power they had only ever feared. The farmer was now a pivotal figure in a story much larger than his own survival, and it had all started because he remembered to be kind. The shaman's declaration of honor did not settle the matter for all. From the silent ranks of the sire, a warrior stepped forward. He was massive, his blue skin crossed with old scars, his muscle built for power, not speed. His name was Kano. His face was a mask of pure scorn as he looked at Caleb, then at Taraval. He saw the honor granted to a pale visitor as an insult, a stain on the purity and strength of their kind. It was a betrayal of their ways. He did not shout. His voice was a low growl that carried across the open ground. He demanded proof. The human's worth, the shaman's judgment, it all had to be tested. He called for a trial by combat. The rules were ancient and simple. First blood. A single cut would decide it. The challenge was not just to Caleb. It was a direct challenge to Taraval's authority, to his right to bestow such a high honor on an outsider. The shaman's word was supposed to be final. Kano was making it a question. To refuse the challenge was not an option. In the rigid code of the Nyavi, refusal would be seen as a sign of weakness. It would invalidate the shaman's blessing before it was even fully given. It would prove Kano right that the human was unworthy and the shaman's judgment was flawed. The fragile peace built on a single act of mercy would shatter before it began. The honor debt would mean nothing if the one who incurred it could not defend the status it granted. The matchup was a brutal joke. Caleb was a farmer. His body was shaped by labor. His skills were for mending and growing. Kano was a born warrior, a champion of the sire. His entire life had been a preparation for combat, for dominance. His movements were economical, his posture that of a predator waiting to strike. The outcome seemed predetermined. It felt less like a trial and more like a formality, a quick, violent ritual to appease tradition before the inevitable conclusion was reached. But the code demanded an answer. A challenge issued must be met. There was no room for negotiation for alternative tests. The law was the law. Caleb looked from Kano's cold, confident eyes to the faces of the human council, their expressions a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. He looked at Liara, who watched, her own face tight with a worry she could not show. This was not a fight for pride. There was no glory to be won here. Winning was survival. Winning was validating the shaman's decision. Winning was making the peace real. He had to step into that circle not as a warrior but as a symbol. He had to legitimize the new understanding between their peoples with his own blood, or see it fail before it started. The farmer's hands, made for holding tools, would have to hold a weapon. His mind, which thought in seasons and harvests, would have to think in seconds and movements. The fate of the alliance, the shaman's honor, and his own life now rested on a fight he was not built for. He had to find a way to win. The circle formed in the dirt between the settlement and the Na'vi ranks. It was a ring of solemn faces, human and alien, with the two combatants at its center. Kano moved first. He closed the distance with a predator's speed, his right arm pulling back for a strike. The attack was a blur of muscle and motion, a classic power strike aimed to end things fast. It wasn't a test. It was an execution. Caleb didn't meet it. He moved back, his boots scuffing the dirt. He sidestepped the main force of the blow, feeling the wind of it pass his face. He defended, he dodged. He used his knowledge of the ground, the slight unevenness of the terrain he'd walked 100 times to keep his footing. He didn't try to block the strikes. He let them come and he moved out of the way. He avoided the killing blows through movement, not strength. He didn't try to match Kano's power. That was a quick way to get his arms broken. He used his agility, the lighter frame of a farmer used to navigating tight spaces and uneven ground. He let Kano's anger do the work for him. Every missed swing, every furious lunge wasted the warrior's energy. Kano was used to opponents who stood and fought, who tested their strength against his. Caleb gave him nothing to hit but air and dust. He watched. While he moved, he studied. He saw the pattern in the attacks. The power came from the right side. Every lunge, every committed strike, ended with Kano putting his full weight on his right leg for a fraction of a second to recover his balance. It was a slight favoring, a tiny window of vulnerability. It might have been an old injury, or just the natural consequence of putting everything into a blow. Caleb saw it. He filed it away. Liara watched from the Na'vi side. Her face was a mask of cool observation, but her eyes tracked every movement. He could see her strategic mind working, calculating angles and opportunities. She saw the same patterns he did, but she could not interfere. This was his fight. Her intervention would only invalidate the trial, proving him weak. She had to stand and watch, her knowledge useless to him now. He made his move. He feinted left, a quick shift of his weight that suggested a dodge in that direction. It was a farmer's trick, the kind of motion used to herd a skittish animal. Kano took the bait. He committed to another furious lunge to his own left, his right arm swinging wide to cover the area where he thought Caleb would be. His weight went onto that right leg. Caleb wasn't there. He sidestepped to the right instead, inside the arc of the swing. He didn't use his own blade to attack Kano's body. That would have left him open to a counter. He brought his weapon up in a short, sharp motion, not to cut, but to deflect. The flat of his blade smacked against Kano's own forearm right at the wrist, guiding the warrior's momentum just enough. Kano's own razor edge, carried by his own uncontrollable force, grazed against the blue skin of his other arm. It was a shallow cut, a thin line that appeared instantly. A bead of blue-silver blood welled up from the fine scratch. The fight stopped. The first blood was drawn, not by Caleb's aggression, not by a skilled attack. It was drawn by Kano's own anger, channeled and redirected by a farmer's defense and quiet intelligence. Caleb stood his ground, his weapon held ready, his breathing even. He had won without landing a single attack of his own. He had turned the warrior's greatest strength into his only weakness. The victory was complete, and it was utterly humiliating for the Na'vi champion. Kano stood frozen. The thin line of blue on his arm seemed to glow. His rage did not erupt. It condensed. The hot, explosive anger of the fight cooled into something far more dangerous, a cold, focused hatred. He was not just beaten. He was humiliated, and in front of his entire tribe by a farmer's trick. His eyes, when they lifted from the cut to find Caleb, held no heat. Only a promise. This was not over. It was just beginning. He was now a personal, dedicated threat to the fragile new thing they were trying to build. Taroval stepped into the circle. His movement was a command in itself. He declared the trial finished. The debt was honored. The shaman's voice carried the weight of finality. He would brook no further challenge to his judgment, not today. The formalities of their code were satisfied. Then he turned his attention to the human council, to Fletcher, who watched with a new, wary respect. He pledged a formal pact: mutual defense against the Croce raiders, shared access to hunting grounds his people knew well. It was a future the colony could never have dreamed of. A lifeline thrown to a people drowning in scarcity and fear. It was everything they needed, but the cost was already visible. Taraval's gaze did not miss the way Kano finally turned and walked back to the ranks, his loyalists closing around him. Their low murmurs were a current of dissent beneath the shaman's words. Not all Nyavi accepted this. For them, the old ways were the true ways. Strength was everything. Alliance with the fallen sky people was a betrayal of their very identity. The peace was real. The pact was made. But it was built on a foundation of one man's humiliation, and that made it fragile from the very start. Caleb's victory had won the day, but it had also created a powerful, patient enemy. Kano's rage would not dissipate. It would fester. It would look for weaknesses in the new alliance, for chances to prove the shaman wrong, to prove the human weak, to restore the old order where might made right. The peace was a delicate construct, and Kano was the fault line running right through its center. Caleb was no longer just a farmer. He was a symbol of the alliance. He was the bridge between two terrified peoples. And for that very reason, he was also a target. His safety was now directly tied to the success of the pact. Every step he took would be watched by friends and enemies alike. His actions would be interpreted, his mistakes magnified. He had wanted no part of this. He had only wanted to help one injured person. Now he was the key to a fragile peace and the focal point for all the anger that peace provoked. The duel had settled the immediate question. It had forced the Nyavi to accept the shaman's decree. It had given the humans their desperately needed alliance, but in doing so it planted the seeds of the next conflict. It proved that strength could be defeated by wit, and for some that was an unforgivable heresy. The victory was real, but the price would be a constant low-grade war of attrition, a silent struggle against the bitterness he had created by winning. The peace was secured, but it came with a timer, and only Kano knew when it would run out. Taroval used his fingers. He mixed the ash from a dead fire with fine gray clay from the riverbank. He worked the paste in a shallow stone bowl, his movement slow and deliberate. This was an ancient Nyavi ritual. The substance was not just paint. It was a contract. The mark he was about to make was for kin, for those bound by unbreakable honor and shared blood. It was the highest recognition their culture offered. He turned to Caleb. The farmer stood still, the eyes of both species on him. The shaman's fingers, cool and dry, touched his forehead. Taroval painted a single vertical stripe from his hairline down to the bridge of his nose. The paint was cool at first, then it seemed to warm against his skin. The white stood out starkly against his human pallor, a bright line in the dim light. This was a declaration. A public statement for all to see. This human was under the shaman's direct protection. He was part of the sire's honor. To harm him now was to harm the tribe itself. The mark was a shield and a brand, rewriting his identity in the eyes of every Nyavi present. He was no longer just Caleb Mercer. He was kin. For the human colonists watching, the sign was bewildering. It was a terrifying violation of everything they knew. A member of their community, marked by the very beings they had feared as monsters. But underneath the fear, another feeling stirred. A thin, fragile thread of hope. If one of theirs could earn this, then the stories were wrong. The world was not simply divided into us and them. There was a third path, and Caleb was walking it. For the Nyavi, the moment was a seismic shift. A precedent was set, one that would ripple through their society for generations. A pale visitor had been brought into the fold, his status changed by an act of compassion, not conquest. Their world, once defined by strict separation, now had a human-shaped door in it. The old ways were not broken, but they were forever bent to include this new reality. Taraval then turned his attention to the future. He appointed Liara as the Nyavi representative to the Pale visitors. She would be their voice, the translator of culture and need. Her strategic mind and first-hand experience made her the only logical choice. She accepted the duty with a solemn nod, her eyes meeting Caleb's. The wounded warrior he'd found in the grass was now a diplomat. She still had the thermal blanket. The crinkly silver sheet he'd used to fight her fever was folded neatly and tucked into her gear. It was no longer just a source of warmth. It was a relic, a physical artifact of the first act, the moment a farmer's mercy overcame a colony's fear. It was the seed from which this entire alliance had grown. The resolution was clear. A simple, impulsive choice to help a wounded stranger had become the foundation for a new law between species. It was not a law written on paper or carved in stone. It was written in ash and clay on a human brow, and it was built on the unshakable ground of honor and a returned blanket. This was how interstellar law was born, not in council chambers but in barns, with acts of quiet courage that changed the definition of us and them forever. The story ends where it began, with a choice. The colony still stands on Nova. The harsh suns still bake the domes. The Croce raiders still prowl the perimeter, a threat that hasn't vanished. Some things don't change. The struggle for resources continues. The prefab walls still feel thin against the vastness of this alien world. The reality of their existence remains a hard, unyielding fact. But the fear feels different now. The old dread was a solid thing, a constant weight on every shoulder. It was the fear of the unknown, of the faceless azure monster in the dark. That fear has been tempered. It hasn't vanished, but it's been alloyed with something new and fragile. A thin strand of hope now runs through the colony's heart. It's in the way people glance toward the fence line and don't immediately flinch. It's in the quieter conversations, the less frantic ration counts. The air itself feels lighter, even if the danger is just as real. Caleb still tends his algae vats. His hands still work the filters, his back still aches from the labor. It is his anchor, the one piece of his old life that remains. But his world has expanded far beyond the barn. Now he also sits in council with Taraval. He stands in the comms hub with the human leadership. He translates not just language but intent, bridging the vast gap of culture and suspicion between his people and the sire. He is a farmer, a defender, and an envoy. He wears all three titles, each one feeling heavier than the last. Liara moves. She is the link, the living proof of the pact. She travels between the human settlement and the Nyavi migration routes, a blue-skinned diplomat carrying messages and maps. She coordinates patrols, shares knowledge of Croce movements, teaches the humans about the land they landed on but never truly understood. Her presence is no longer a secret to be hidden. It is a sign of the new reality, a promise made flesh and blood. The alliance is young. It is untested in any real prolonged crisis. It is built on a duel and a debt, not on years of shared history. It could fracture under the first serious Croce assault, or under the weight of internal doubt from both sides. Kano and his loyalists are a quiet storm waiting to break. The peace is real, but it is not yet strong. It is a seedling in harsh soil. It did not start with a grand treaty signed in some hall. It did not begin with a weapons triumph or a strategic masterstroke. It started in the tall grass at dusk. It began with a farmer seeing a shape in the weeds, a flicker of blue where there shouldn't be. It was the simple human act of seeing someone in need and deciding not to look away. He saw past the color of her skin, past the stories of monsters, and recognized a living being in pain. He chose to help. The colony's law screamed at him to walk away, to preserve himself, to think of the many. But he listened to an older, quieter law. He helped because he believed it was the right thing to do. He helped because, in that moment, he was the only one who could. It was a choice made without calculation of reward or consequence. It was a choice made from a place of basic human decency, a lesson learned at his mother's knee on a world far from this one. The resolution is this. The boy who gave his blanket to a shivering alien girl, the farmer who mended a fence and then broke the biggest rule of all, did not just save a single life. He rerouted the future. His one quiet act of defiance against fear changed the fate of 2 entire species. It proved that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about the choice you make while you're afraid. And sometimes the most powerful weapon on any frontier isn't something you fire. It's something you give away. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to act in spite of it. Caleb Mercer's story proves the most powerful weapon on any frontier isn't a railgun or a starship. It's our own humanity. A simple act of compassion can rewrite the fate of entire civilizations. That choice is always there. What would you do if you found her bleeding in the grass? The frontier holds countless more stories. Subscribe to see where courage leads us next. The rust-colored xenograss swayed in the evening breeze, its stalks taller than a man and sharp enough to cut bare skin. Caleb moved along the perimeter fence, running a gloved hand over the humming wires, checking for weak spots or animal damage. Routine work. Necessary work. The twin moons were just beginning their climb, casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape. A flicker of color caught his eye. Wrong color. A slash of cerulean blue where there should only be orange and brown. He stopped, hand still on the wire. He squinted into the fading light. It was a shape, low to the ground, partially hidden by the thick grass. It wasn't the right shape for a rock or a bush. It moved. A slow, pained drag. A shuddering motion that spoke of injury, not purpose. It wasn't grazing or hunting. It was trying to crawl. The movement was all wrong. A broken rhythm that set his nerves on edge. He took a cautious step forward, then another, moving past the fence line into the contested space. The moon's light grew stronger as the suns dipped below the horizon. It fell on the shape, revealing details. Blue skin, matted with something dark and thick. A viscous fluid that looked black in the twilight. The form was humanoid. Slender, built for a lighter gravity, maybe. It was clad in practical gear. Hides tanned to a soft leather and strange plant fibers woven into a protective harness. It was a person. An injured person. A brutal gash ran along its side from the lower ribs down toward the hip. The wound seeped an iridescent fluid that wasn't blood as he knew it. It was thinner, almost silvery, and it seemed to harden on contact with the air, forming a strange crusted seal around the injury even as more liquid welled up from beneath. The physiology was completely alien. His training, the colony's law, every survival instinct he'd learned in 3 brutal years, screamed at him. This is an azure one. The absolute forbidden. The rules were simple, absolute, and born from fear. Report it, leave it. Let the night or the predators finish it. Do not engage. Do not approach. The penalty for contact was exile. They'd strip you of your rations, your place in the dome, your protection. They'd push you beyond the fence with nothing. If they thought you were a traitor, if they were especially afraid, the penalty could be quicker. A bullet was cleaner than starvation. The law was clear. His hand went to the comm unit on his belt. His thumb hovered over the call button. He looked at the figure in the grass. It tried to push itself up again, failed, and collapsed back into the weeds with a soft, stifled sound. It wasn't a monster from a cautionary tale. It was a living thing, alone and in terrible pain. The sight of that suffering triggered something deeper than fear, something older than colony law. It was a basic human instinct that recognized agony and the need for aid. The calculation of survival warred with the impulse of mercy, and for a long moment he was frozen between them. A farmer standing on the line between 2 worlds. 2 voices warred in his head. One was loud, insistent, full of the practical fear that had kept him alive for 3 years. The other was quiet, a soft, stubborn whisper from a time before this harsh world. They pulled him in opposite directions, each with its own undeniable logic. The council's edict was clear. It was simple, brutal, and born from loss. It wasn't created by cruel men, but by desperate ones. Every rule, every restriction came from a funeral, a shortage, or a failed gamble. Contact with the indigenous species was the absolute line. They didn't understand them. Their biology was a mystery, their intentions unknown. The only safe choice was to pretend they didn't exist. The law was a shield, and to break it was to shatter that protection for everyone. Helping this creature was a direct violation. It risked everything he had, his place in the dome, his daily rations, the fragile safety of the fence line, his life. If he was caught, they wouldn't ask for an explanation. They would just make an example. Exile was a death sentence. A quicker, quieter end was also a possibility if the security team was jumpy. The risk was absolute and the potential reward was 0. It was the worst kind of math, and it could be a trap. The Crochet Raiders were cunning. They used misdirection, ambushes, psychological terror, an injured alien, a supposed victim placed perfectly for a lone colonist to find. It reeked of their cruel tactics. It could be bait to lure him out, to capture him for whatever grim purposes they had for prisoners. Even if it wasn't the Crochet, helping her could bring a different kind of wrath. If her people found one of their own in a human barn, what would they do? The settlement was struggling to fend off raiders. It couldn't survive an attack from an entire tribe of natives. But his mother's voice persisted underneath the fear. It wasn't a philosophical argument. It wasn't a grand moral stance. It was just something she'd said back on Earth in their small garden. You help because you can. She said it while handing a cool cloth to a friend with sunstroke. She said it while helping a lost dog find its way home. It was a simple code from a simpler time, a reflexive impulse to ease suffering when you saw it. It wasn't about strategy. It was about being a person. The two choices laid themselves out before him, cold and clear. To leave her was to condemn her. The night was cold. The predators were coming. Her wound was bad. She would die out here alone in the dirt. It was the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice the colony demanded. To help her was to betray his own kind. It was to put his needs, his conscience, above the survival of 200 other people. It was an act of profound selfishness draped in the guise of mercy. It was a betrayal of every trust placed in him. He stood at the crossroads of two completely different ways of being. One was the calculation of pure survival, a numbers game where one life was an acceptable loss for the stability of the many. The other was the raw, illogical imperative of mercy, an impulse that asked for no calculation, that simply demanded action in the face of pain. His thumb was still on the comm button. The rational choice was to press it, to report the contact, to walk away and let the system handle it. He knew what the system would do. The system would let her die. His choice in the end wasn't strategic. It was human. He took his thumb off the button.